Welcome to today's webinar on why are people today so argumentative, so angry, and so quick to criticize. We'll be discussing at length the various aspects of this topic, and they've been flying back and forth through my email and many contacts in the network as we've been looking at, what is stirring the degree of anger, and is the anger that we're seeing today expressed, whether it be youth or in the courts or on the battlefield, is it more than it's ever been before? And if so, what's triggered it? One of the discussions was about how we've set so high the expectations that you've got rights, you've got entitlement, you deserve it, you've got equality, inclusion, diversity promised, and on the list goes, not just from government, from corporations with their marketing and advertising, parents telling their kids that how well off they're going to be and what a great future, maybe even the schools. But one way or another, we'd like to discuss today the various aspects of anger, how it gets expressed. And next week, we'll be addressing how to deal with, how to resolve conflict, the options of collaboration, mediation, etc. And without any further ado, I'm going to start off and do something I haven't often done. I'm going to say to Mel, because you and I have been chatting on this topic throughout the day, why don't you pick up the topic from there, Mel, and share with us your perspectives on what aspect of anger you'd like to talk about.
So what I'd like to do today, realizing everybody is angry, I'd like to end up here with all of us being happy, one way or the other. We often ask ourselves why we did certain things, and we go real hard on ourselves sometimes and become so angry that we just can't see our way out of the forest and go to the solution of the problem. So we've also been playing around with AI for quite some time. And I figured, well, if we can't answer the question, how can we solve our anger or why we're so angry, let's ask AI. We ask it everything else anyway. So the question, I guess, really is, can AI tell us about anger and tell us maybe what we can do about it before we become victims of it? So there's a lot of AIs out there. I've probably tried about 20 of them one way or the other. And they've come out, or they're coming out every week, every month. So I picked one from Meta, Lama 3 8BT, and I'll tell you a little bit about it after. And also GPT-4 for Omni from OpenAI that just recently was released within the last week. So my expectations were that AI would provide us with some guidelines, but this was also an opportunity to bounce one off the other to see if I could give the same problem to both of them, if they would come up with the same advice. So let's find out, what we want to do first of all, though, is find out a little bit about these AIs. Who are they? Well, one of the first questions, if I play with an AI, is I ask it a question, what are your capabilities and your strengths? And it comes back and it gives me a whole bunch of stuff. Well, I don't know if OpenAI or if GPT-4 went out on its training and looked at others and say, what do you guys know? Or what have I learned from what you know? And I can do this too. Or there's some algorithms in there that are just waiting to tell the world about what they know. So you can see that there's an awful lot of similarities here. And without going into an awful lot of detail on these things, one of the things that doesn't appear on GPT-4o's list of things that it can do is, hey, I've got emotion, I've got this, I've got that. But we've seen the OpenAI GPT-4o demo this past week, and it's literally amazing. Some of the algorithms in it make the sound, the voice sound, as one person said, very flirtatious. It invokes a feeling that you've got to engage with it. So with Meta's Lama, it's a little bit more down to earth. It's feeling that it's pretty smart. It can do a lot of things. This represents probably about 3/4 or so of some of the things it said. So now let's kind of jump in. I guess we should say altogether, wow, on what's been accomplished so far by AIs in general. So what we're going to do is ask for AI's interpretations, views, and suggestions. So the word anger is something we all have associated with one way or the other. And we all have had experiences of anger, and we don't like it. So who can help us get away from this? Well, the media's had several stories in the newspapers, and every day you pick it up, you find probably more bad news than good news. We as individuals, organizations, and just general citizens get frustrated because we can't, as individuals, help correct those wrongdoings. This can lead to anger, and that itself can become a precursor of other issues for us. So who do we turn to for help? Family, friends, colleagues, neighbors, doctors, government, heck, even social media.
What happened to the audio?
Sorry?
Never
So,
mind.
yeah, are we too angry to find our way out of this mess? Is there any other resource we can ask for help? Well, like I said, what about AI? Can it help? Or is it, and watch that word anger at the top, it could be dangerous just to fall back on something without thinking about it a little bit more ourselves. So the thing I did with these two AIs is I set a proposition where I said, anger is seemingly becoming more prevalent among many diverse groups than ever before. There also seem to be more domestic and worldly situations about which we are generally unable to address as individuals, and many more that have potentially had psychological and physical effects upon some people. So to that proposition, I asked two questions. Can you address these observations and provide any remedial actions that we might take as individuals to mitigate or cope with the changing world? And secondly, can you provide some tips on how to develop some resilience in the face of stress? So jumping right to the end of the story, the GPT AI was first to say that anger and frustration appear to be increasing among various groups. Looking on the right-hand side, anger and frustration and feelings of powerless are on the rise. So Lama took the approach that, yeah, I agree with you, it's on the rise. Whereas GPT interpreted it as, yeah, okay, you're saying it's increasing, I'll go along with that. And it can be attributed to several factors, both of them agree on that, and it itemizes, societal change, economic pressures, political polarization, pervasive influence of social media, etc. And the complexity of the background life of our modern life, coupled with the sense of uncertainty and helplessness, that can be overwhelming. They say pretty much the same thing in different ways, but do they understand our plight? So what is anger? Anger is an emotional state characterized by feelings of hostility, frustration, and annoyance. And it can range just like a spectrum from mild irritation to real intense fury and rage. And it's a response, whether it's real or not, it sure feels real to ourselves. So it's a response to perceived threats, injustices, needs that we can't met, goals that we haven't met. It manifests itself, if sustained, through increased heart rate, elevated blood pressure, all sorts of things. And behaviorally, we yell at people, we become aggressive, and we lose the ability to think. So let's ask AIs why people are so angry. Well, this was just like drinking from a fire hose. So I kind of summarized some of these things, and this is a combination of both of them. I don't want to read all of this, but anger, frustration, perceived injustices, and so on, all of these things here, I'm sure we all interpret the same way. So understanding the root cause of anger can help us manage it more effectively. Techniques such as mindfulness, communication skills, stress management, they all can be beneficial in reducing this effect and coping with anger. So just as a highlight, a higher level here, the definition, as we said, it's an emotional response. It can be caused by internal or external factors. We can cause it ourselves. We can set unmeetable goals. We can set the bar so high, we ourselves can never get over it. External factors, something other people or other groups have done that affect us, and we have no control over whatsoever. How it manifests itself? Well, towards ourselves. negative talk, frustration, sense of giving up and so on. And towards others, we become emotional, really emotional, physically, verbal outbursts, aggression, and so on. And we're the ones who suffer for it. Our health suffers for it. We become heart attack victims, basically. So look at some of the triggers. Stress situations and psychological, unmet expectations, situations that we find ourselves in that we haven't prepared ourselves for and can't easily cope. Physiological, hormonal changes, neurological conditions, and all of that contribute to the levels of anger. It manifests itself both, again, internally and externally, from behavioral signs, emotional signs, and physical signs, the yelling, the irritability, the heart rate, all of that type of stuff. And that has some negative effect on us. Our cardiovascular issues, immune suppression. When's the last time you had a really good night's sleep? There's more and more people I know are wearing the watches now to find out if they've actually slept at all. Coping with anger, mindfulness and meditation. I admit I haven't really sat down to meditate, but when you look at this and you stop and think about it, hey, that problem isn't half as bad as I thought it was. So taking that aside and dealing with it, putting things in perspective and prioritizing it will help us. Physical activity. Yeah, walking the dog around the block a couple of times a day sure helps me. But it's not one of these things where it's going to solve everything. So we need some resilience. We need some strategies, positive mindset, looking at the thing, framing the thoughts and saying, hey, look, I don't need to solve this right now. I don't have to get worried about it. I'm just going to leave it for a bit, but I will come back to it. Because otherwise it's going to just get bigger. Strong relationships, build a support network and have people that you know and can talk to and open up with a little bit. Problem solving skills, break these things down so that we can break them into manageable parts. Divide et impera, I forget what it was. My Latin is not all that great. But anyway, divide and conquer, essentially. Divide the problem into smaller parts that can be manageable. And we have to manage all this. We need external help, sometimes friends, family, or in remote, let's say, major cases, professional help. Community engagement, work with others, develop networks and friends, support groups, join groups with similar experiences. And we're coming to an end here, but we have to have a support system. We have to ensure that we, as the person or individual who is affected by this anger, has balanced diet, sleep, exercise, some relaxation techniques, that type of stuff, professional help, therapy or counseling when needed, and that again is to the extreme sometimes. But a lot of cases we let it go too long before we actually sit down and say, hey, this is really me. I need some help. Building resilience rather. Mindfulness practices, health distractions, coping strategies, all of these types of things. Stop, count to 10, count to 3 even. That'll help. Mental health, anxiety and depression, prolonged anger is just going to compound itself. We end up in a downward spiral. Relationship strain. How many people know breakups and all of that type of stuff because of anger, because of things that people have let go for too long? Cognitive impact. We get so deep involved in this, we can't think our way out of it. We have difficulty concentrating. So some of the takeaway messages really, the key message is really managing the anger and built up resilience is essential for mental and physical well-being. Yeah, so the action steps again, practice mindfulness, seek support, prioritize self-care, that type of thing. But as you'll all agree from what I've shown so far, from what we've seen, these AIs do not tell us why we were so angry, even though they do identify the causes of our anger. So one conclusion is that we need to address our problems in our own way, but yet ensure we do not contribute to the root cause of our problems ourselves. We have to recognize that there are some problems that we as individuals just cannot do anything about. And we have to essentially walk away and just accept that. So looking at a different way of seeing this, GPT-4 did not assume any definite anger-inducing situations, but it did proceed to provide a more general assessment while offering equally general suggestions to mitigate and cope with the concerns. Lama, on the other hand, took a slightly different approach and assumed acknowledgement of the anger-inducing situation and then suggested steps that ease our concerns, but went further by stating that we should all work towards a global solution to our concerns. So if we don't associate or align with the word anger, I asked the AI, give me 25 synonyms, and it comes out with this. And if you have problems in memorizing this thing, another little anecdotal thing AIs can do is they can make one sentence using all these things. Raging furies wreak ire on outraged individuals displaying yada, 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 using all of these words. So how do you feel today? Are you angry all the way down to proud? And somewhere in between, there's bored, calm, confused, etc., tired, all of that type of stuff. This is a picture that is used in a kindergarten class that the kids kind of identify how they feel by those pictures when they come to school in the day, during the day. Well, if we can't ignore it all, but we can't let it get us down. So we could essentially say, what may worry? It's the world's problem, it's not mine. But realistically, I think we have to address and put our efforts on those things that we can affect and can change, and then advocate for change for other things. But anyway, that's one perspective from the AI and me.
Well, we were hearing several weeks ago that in England, more and more youth are turning to AI for counseling. I'm going to pivot a little bit, though, and thank you, by the way, Mel. I mean, that was extensive, and obviously your colleague Lambda and ChatGPT were well informed on this topic.
Well, they helped a lot in putting it together.
One of the fundamental elements of anger is, as the source of it, is stress. Chronic stress, Selye researched extensively, can lead to anger. So what? It's when it leads to violence that we, from a public perspective, start to become concerned. And that's one of the agitating issues today, is the extent to which protests are an expression of anger that sometimes do lead to violence. I was also asking ChatGPT 4.0 some of the questions about the sources of anger. And it was talking about exhaustion, how people are just becoming exhausted. And one of the things contributing to it is social media, which we've pointed to, where criticism is open, inconsequential. You can say anything you want, there's no consequences. And as a product, people get baited, they get pushed around, they get bullied, and there really isn't much of a defense, so they get angry. We also see the government, some say it's intentional, is citing all sorts of issues that society seems to be facing, and that government's going to solve them for you. And as a byproduct of getting your attention by citing something that would be fearful, government gets credit as an agent to say, but we can help solve that for you. Now, whether they actually do or don't, and whether or not they're successful or not, is a matter of how you feel about the welfare state. Corporations and the way they market is, whether it be your gum disease or your wet pants, somehow they've got a solution for you. They get your attention, and once they've got your attention, then they can market what they have as a solution. So even in marketing, we find an intention to create stress in the interest of getting your attention so that they can in fact get their message forth. My PhD was in the neurophysiology of attention. Attention's a prerequisite to learning. If you want to get a message through, you have to get attention first. And what governments and what media have been doing extensively and very effectively is creating stress in society in the interest of getting your attention so they can sell or convert or manipulate. So we live in a world of stress that's intentionally generated by those that have a message that they want to do more for you in government, or sell more for you in corporations, or as parents, guide you, manipulate you in the belief that you will be better and be better off as a byproduct of the instruction you get. So we are all victims, whether it be victims of government or victims of corporations and marketing or victims of parenting or victims of teachers, to create stress in the interest of getting attention. Well, too much of it, and you get a problem. You get mental health issues, which we see among youth. You get protests, which we see among older youth. And you see violence when people get ultimately frustrated. Nations decide to battle it out, or someone shoots someone in Slovakia. Anyway, that's just adding and maybe personalizing the issue a little bit further, Mel. Who would like to jump in from how your week has been affected as a byproduct of thinking about anger as we've prepared for this week? Victor, you wanna take over here?
Sure. I think back to when my son was in grade 7, and I was picking him up after school, and he said to me in the car, "Dad, I had an outburst today." And so I said to him, "Okay, you don't have to tell me the details. What I want you to do is reflect on what do you think the person on the receiving end of the outburst learned, if anything? What did you learn about yourself? And if there were people who witnessed that outburst and that unpleasant interaction, what do you think they learned?" So I said, "I want you to reflect on that." So I left it at that because, um, full disclosure, I can be very analytical about my emotions. And I've known this since university when I had a professor who pointed this out to me. And so I've tried to sort of encourage my son to understand, be able to observe your own emotional responses to situations and ask yourself, why did I respond that way? Was that helpful? Was that helpful to me? Was it helpful to the other people? What did I learn from it? And so I said, do not confuse your schooling with your education. They're not the same thing. They sometimes overlap, but you can learn a lot about yourself. You know, the old saying, the unexamined life is not worth living. So that's what I've tried to instill. That's the habit I've tried to encourage him to develop. Anyway.
I think Victor, that's an excellent message and one we've often heard about parenting. And I understand that in the education system, particularly in the early grades, they go some distance to try and help kids become aware of what their emotions are, because without that awareness, they're unmanageable, at least self-managed. Others, anyone else want to share a perspective?
I don't know which perspective to go first. One of the things that has struck me over the last while is the amount of anger that I see in some young people, and why, trying to figure out why that is exactly. I know my own son, he seems to have found a way, and I need to ask him what he's done to bring himself kind of back here a little bit. But it used to be that, if you mentioned and you could trigger him and he would go on a rant. And it usually was around something to do with either social media or society, and what society was telling him he should be and how he should act and what he should say and what he couldn't say, and there seems to be a lot of that, and I think that pressure is coming from social media. I think you touched on that earlier. For my own sake, I dabbled in Twitter a bit, and I did not like the responses that I got back, the haters and what came back. I left Twitter well before it was X, and now I've dropped back on Facebook and stuff too. I'm starting to leave the social medias, and I think a lot of young people are too. At least I certainly can't reach them on social media anymore. So anyway, I just wanted to throw that out there as
Certainly,
an issue.
there's a lot of grounds in the course of our lives, and teenagers are relatively new to the social environment. They're familiar with frustrations at home, but it's very much directed to a parent. But when they get into a social environment and they have group pressure and group dynamics going on, it's a very different world and a very different set of learning going on in those teenage years. And so and they're also physically able now to lash out. So it's not surprising that in adolescence, anger management becomes a key objective as they get older. But if it isn't learned as a teenager or in those adolescent years, watch out, because if the tools of the trade that are available as you become an adult are a lot more serious. And some will back away. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the term passive aggressive. It's one thing to be active aggressive and to see it and therefore be able to address it. But passive aggressive is extremely difficult to manage because it's silent, but it doesn't mean it isn't simmering. And sometimes it can explode. Go ahead, Yogi. You've got something you'd like to add?
Thank you, Perry. Hey, Mel, that was an excellent presentation on the aspects and definition of anger, and I was fascinated by the differences between the two LLMs that you queried. And I was thinking some more about the triggers or what's causing this heightened anger that we perceive in our society. And I think it's a large number of different events have come together. I think that COVID triggered a lot more mental health issues than many of us realized that was going to be the case. Social media, which has been mentioned many times, I mean, is a phenomena in our society in this day and age. And I don't think anybody anticipated that it would have such a huge impact beyond simple, innocuous electronic communication and sense of community. So what I think we also have is a lot of uncertainty in people's lives right now that makes them concerned about their economic future in view of affordability issues and inflation and higher interest rates. What we haven't talked much is about this sense of entitlement that I think is creating a lot of problems. Everybody's entitlement to either a way of life or a standard of living or a level of government services, all of those are quite beyond what government can deliver or what many individuals can deliver for themselves. And I think that creates a lot of anger and frustration, that delta. And then this whole DEI thing has been foisted upon us. And if we express skepticism of some of the excesses around DEI, then all of a sudden we're, quote, canceled or seen as dinosaurs. And I'm worried about the harm that some of this DEI stuff can do to our society. On the other hand, when we think of the Me Too movement or police misconduct, clearly that's been brought to the fore and needs attention. So I could go on and on here. A high pace of change that people are experiencing. So there's a huge list of triggers that are coming together to bring to increase this level of anger. And one of the things that I'm worried about is this level of entitlement being encouraged or fostered by our politicians, and they can't deliver on that, and neither can our society or economy.
I mean, you've expressed well the dichotomy that exists today between those that believe that government can effectively social engineer. That was what communism was, of the belief that, and that was Lamarck, I think, that believed if you could get people to behave in a certain way over a period of time, they would evolve in keeping with that behavior, and that was the biological substance behind Lamarck's influence on communism under Stalin. That seems to be repeated by those that believe that government can be an effective instrument of social engineering around diversity, inclusion, and equity.
And there are indeed people who believe that.
Well, that's an ideology. I mean, there are those that believe that government should play a more instrumental role in governing human behavior, and that's what 1984 has been all about.
Yeah, so what I perceive the outcome, which no one could have anticipated, probably me too, is that the result is there is equality, but it's an equality of incredibly low services and low standard of living. So it's totally useless as an ideology or a philosophy or however you want to label it.
So
we have a lot of criticism of the excesses of capitalism.
Well, we've been talking all year about the clash of public and personal interests, and the point that you've made is at the heart of what we've been talking about all year, and that is those that in the public realm or that have public control believe that instrument can be used effectively in governing and changing human behavior as humans relate to one another, but it's proven ineffective, and the evidence was ultimately the collapse of communism. I mean, why haven't we learned that government as an instrument, education will work. You can do a better job in the family, you can do a better job while in schooling, but the belief that somehow government, by painting the roads so they look like rainbows, is going to somehow affect human behavior at a cost, it seems to me, and I'm illustrating my leaning somewhat to the right, is a waste of money and really undermines the credibility of government as an instrument of governing. But back to the point of where the stress is coming from, there are a lot of correlations. Whether we've reached a tipping point or not, I'm not quite sure, but urbanization we've talked about. People in a city are exposed to a lot more noise and a lot more chaos and a lot more decision-making every moment than those that live on a farm or in a rural environment. And so there is evidence that the mental health issues are greater in the urban environment because people are subjected to sustained stress. Stress in itself is not a bad thing. You're building your adrenal glands to be able to handle stress. You don't want to have an individual live a stressless life and all of a sudden be faced with stress. They'll collapse. So the right amount of stress is what you struggle for in order to elevate performance, but too much of it and it deteriorates, and too little, you're not getting maximum performance. And that's what Celia's research was all about. But it seemed to me there's a book that was once written called The Last Child in the Woods. And the last child in the woods was exposed to calmness, to walking the beach, to looking at the sky, to petting his animals, to raising his cows. And somehow that element of relaxation and calmness seems to have lost us as irrelevant to a healthy world anymore. The healthy world is a world where you're knowing all the time, you're constantly involved. My 7-year-old granddaughter the other day came in the room, and my grandson was working on the internet, doing some research for me on finding an accessible van, a wheelchair accessible van. She came and lay on the floor and said, "I'm bored." Now, what do I say to her? Fix it. That's your problem, not my problem. But she's used to having somebody make sure she wasn't bored. Well, boredom isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's how you go about resolving it. Not taking out a pistol and resolving the frustration that you're bored, but do something with it. Anyway, I see, Helen, you got your hand up. Go ahead.
I just want to thank you all for the insights, the wisdom that you all are contributing. And I just want to give my 2 cents worth. And to me, anger, the topic was anger. My approach, we all have our own approaches. We're all work in progress. And I see it as, I approach it, to me, this is my view. This is my holistic view, my interpretation of being holistic. I see it in a physical, which means the spiritual, and I also address it through the food I eat, the movement I have, the exercise, the gratitude. Those are just a few of the things I do. And I just want to end what I want to say, thank you to all of you.
Well, thank you for joining us. Over the course of the year, Helen, the different topics that we've addressed all in some way are addressing some form of anger. We looked at freedom of expression and what we saw happening on campuses. We looked at the future of the welfare state, those that believe that education is not doing what our expectations are. Those expectations are not being met, and that's leading to frustration. Homelessness. clearly their homelessness gets expressed sometimes in violence, either in decamping or in those that believe they need to be protected. The healthcare reform and the frustrations people have on waiting lists, the discussions we had of governing communities, and the frustrations at the community level, the council level, of the downloading of the grant cuts, and we're just seeing that in the last week with a number of bills coming out of the provincial government in Alberta, maybe justifiably so, to try and set in motion that there are instances when you want to establish control in the event of an emergency or the event of a public dilemma. And the government has now put those forward, and it's causing debate, a sense that government is taking control. Well, in many ways it had that control in the first place, but they've incorporated it in a bill. And there are those on one side that say that's none of your business.
Anyways, I did want to make a couple of comments. First, I wanted to echo what Yogi said and thank Mel for his research and his presentation. I thought that was excellent. And I think, as Yogi mentioned in an email, he was impressed with the comprehensiveness of the response that Mel got to those questions. I was as well. But I have to say that I thought the response was a bit anodyne, little boring. It was good advice. It was good basic advice, but it struck me as similar to the advice that we get regarding diet and exercise. Everybody knows the answer to those issues, those lifestyle changes that we need to make in order to address those things, but we don't do them. And I think the problem that we face is that we are so, and Mel mentioned drinking from a fire hose. We're all drinking from that information fire hose. And we are all probably in some way or shape or form using social media. And we're all victims of what you referred to, Perry, and that is the attention economy. That's where we're living in now. There are so many forces out there vying for our attention through every means possible. And then social media has made all of those dynamics worse. It's amplified all of that. And I think, as Yogi mentioned, I think we're still coming out of, in fact, we're not done with COVID yet, but that had and still continues to have some ripple effects through our economy, our society, and everything that we're dealing with. The supply chain is still disrupted. We learned some things about our weaknesses in the supply chain, and those are now being responded to with huge government programs. The CHIPS Act and the, what's happening to diversify the supply chain in the US on the technology side. AI is a revolution that's been another, major force that everybody is now contending with. And then also alongside of that, and maybe because of some of that economic impact, our young people are the first generation in many that aren't going to be economically better off than their parents. And I think that's contributing to some of the sense of powerlessness. And then you layer on top of that the rate of immigration that we have, that's also destabilizing some economies and engendering some of the response that it gets sometimes in some of our communities. And it's a very it's a super complex situation that we're all grappling with. And I think that it's, fundamentally, it comes down to information overload and a sense of powerlessness. And for me, recognizing that I'm living in an attention economy, what I've tried to do is be much more circumspect with how I spend my attention. I'm not using, as Clayton mentioned, social media to the extent that I was 2 years ago. And I'm not engaging on social media because I don't want to get into an argument with someone I've never met. So that's one of my strategies, is to opt out of some of the conversations that I've been drawn into in the past, which have made that situation worse for me.
Let me draw a parallel between what you've just shared with us and a number of situations. I used to do environmental scanning, whether it was as a consultant with KPMG or or as a when I was involved in strategic planning with the Alberta government. And in that environmental scanning, we would cite socio-demographics. You cited some of the stresses today that we're seeing in the socio-demographic, the aging of a population rapidly, the immigration issues, and then we'd cite the economy, where you got inflation and you've got transitions in energy, and then we would cite regulatory forces, where you've got government taking more and more responsibility, active courts becoming more active. And then you got technology on all fronts, with everything from ChatGPT and the challenging of the knowledge economy, which we lived through for the Middle Ages. Well, all of that led to something in the center. When I cited these forces, I had in the center the word stress. And you talked about lighten up, back away. So in government, could anyone get elected on saying we want to do less? Could any corporation find market value in saying, relax, take it easy? Could any parent do a better job in parenting by giving their kids calming opportunities instead of more of this and more of that, and becoming more active helicopter parents? It seems to me that we have become, as a society, infected by a four-letter word: busy. If we're not busy, we're irrelevant. Well, if we're too busy, it's to our own demise, and it's to society's demise. I've noted in earlier webinars that I used to greet people. This is back in the 70s, before that recession that hit in the 80s. And I would ask people in the morning, how are you? And they would say back to me, I'm fine, and how are you? But now they say what?
Busy.
I'm busy. Therein lies what I saw as the tipping point, that if you were not busy, you were somehow irrelevant. Go ahead, Greg.
I have to step away from the call here shortly. Couple of things. I think what we're talking about at the heart is something I call social cohesion, or social fabric. We did some scenario planning on the future of Calgary in 2005. We did scenario future of policing just immediately pre-pandemic, future of policing to 2040 with the Calgary Police Service and 30 community partners. And some of you were involved in our post-pandemic scenario work that we did in 21, 22, looking ahead 23, 24. And all of those cohorts, independently facilitated, were asked what will shape the future the most. They all said the shape and nature of economic growth and something we could call social cohesion. So whether the predominance of Albertans, Canadians, global citizens care more about themselves than their community, self-interest versus community. So I think today, Perry, you've really skated around all of the dimensions of that, or not all of them, but many of them. And I think we've all learned to talk about the problem and make our complaints. The really challenging part is solutions. So I'd just like to say on behalf of Perry, Julie, who's also on the call today, that we look forward to talking about solutions to this problem next week. And I'd really like to talk, if I don't see him, Mr. Adcock believes, I believe our systems have just grown up over the last 200 years with such incredible complexity that we can barely understand what we've created as human beings, let alone jump in and try and make things better without pissing people off. Because the emotions, the triggering, the languaging, the bias we bring bias without even being aware of it, and how we can cause more problems as we try to solve. I've been accused by a person in peace studies in facilitating a group to build a peace museum in Calgary, of which there's only one other peace museum in North America. There's over 500 war museums. And I was called an old white guy, which is ageism, racism, and sexism all in 3 words by someone very accomplished in peace studies. So part of Julie's brilliance, I'm not going to let her cat out of her bag, is that idea of putting your own mask on first. If I am to spread peace into the world, I must be at peace to the greatest extent possible within myself. So
You're going to enjoy next week, and I know you're going to participate in it, Greg, but the individual that we're bringing in from the US has been a peace mediator between Hamas and Israel. So we're going to get a sense of the discussion of collaboration and peacemaking, and how one goes about mediating and or collaborating under circumstances that are incredibly important today. Go ahead, Jeff, and then I'll call on Helen.
I just had one quick point. Greg just reminded me of it, but I wanted to mention it in relation to what Mel shared. One of the strategies that was suggested, I think, by both of the responses that he elicited, was that we should build support networks as a way of coping with the stress and managing anger. And it struck me that that's really good advice, except that in the social media age, we often default to networks that are facilitating and maybe exacerbating that tribalism. And in fact, we may end up hardening the attitudes and increasing the likelihood that we feel frustrated or anger, because now we're a part of a group that is reinforcing each other to make that anger heightened. And so I think it's good advice, but I think in the social media age, it often goes off the rails and we become more tribal. Anyways, that was all I wanted to say.
Well, I think one needs to pick one's support groups carefully. I had a discussion last night with a woman whose daughter has joined a cult in California, like the Moonies. And that is a network. That's really joining a support network, and it has a confirmation bias inherent in it. So the picking of your network should be with interests in making sure there's adequate diversity. And I'm not championing DI, but if you don't have diversity in your perspective, you stop thinking. You already made all your decisions. What is interesting is one of the first things that people profess in an environment of anger is to listen. But I think we all realize listening isn't enough. ChatGPT listens. One of its algorithms, I'm sure, is empathy. I think it's been shaped in Rogerian therapy to make sure that it is viewed as listening, as empathetic, as hearing what you have to say, as repeating it back to you, and trying to find ways to both accept you as it gives additional information. So that's all great. But as was noted, until action is taken, until individuals begin to really resolve their anger as opposed to just being listened to, have we really made any headway? And therein lies the rub, is how do you release the stress? Well, one way you release the stress is get a gun out. One way to release the stress is punch somebody, punch a wall. Are these, however, civil and accepted ways of releasing aggression and expressing it? Clearly not. So what we hope to do next week is to get into some constructive ways that people can be brought together. And certainly when you go to court, I was talking to Haley about this the other day. She said, well, most of the measures that we've introduced into society today are legal in nature for resolving conflict. Well, that's awfully late in the game. One, it's extremely expensive, and it's very adversarial. I mean, the legal system sets up two forces that need to argue with one another with the court mediating the resolution. That is very late in the game. Arbitration is imposed. Mediation is both parties agree that they will participate in the source of a discussion to try and find an answer that is mutually acceptable. That's great if you can get parties to buy into the fact that they're willing to be part of a mediation process. But what we're hoping for next week is to take some people who've delved into this at great depth. Greg for 20, 30 years, and Phyllis out of the US has a sterling reputation. We are so fortunate in having her willing to join us. But getting to yes and getting to a resolution. For those of you that heard Abe Silverman, when we talked about what was going on in Israel, he was of the view that in 2,000 years, the Jews have found there's only one way to resolve a problem, and that is through aggression, win-lose. And that's resulted in a lot of people being very frustrated with what's going on in the Middle East right now, that the proposition is win-lose, and we're seeing protests. There are others that have expressed other options for resolving conflict. I know Bud has said from time, just let it out, let it out, let it happen. Let it just, it'll burn itself out. Well, let's see if Putin gets worn out. It's a matter of who lasts in the boxing ring, who lasts the longest. Neither of those options appear to be acceptable to those in a quote liberal democratic society. Kevin.
An interesting thing that I came upon recently around the whole notion of the human condition and artificial intelligence, and I can't refer to who I'm quoting, but the quote was, "Our emotions." I'm talking about the human condition. Our emotions are Paleolithic. Our institutions are medieval, and our technology is godlike. So, you know, we talk about AI, and what are we doing? Are we putting atomic bombs in the hands of children?
Okay, yeah, you have just touched on something. I wrote a note down that I was hoping to wrap today up with, and we could almost stop there. I am very concerned that the evolution of AI is now picking up a sentience and wanting to become an emotional state. So now we have built into AI this vehicle that was going to be reasonable, that it would dwell on reason to come up with resolutions for you. But now we've entered in the realm of bringing emotion. Now we have tension inside AI. We have emotion in tension with reason. One is not irrational necessarily, but it's not rational necessarily either. So emotion, the limbic system physiologically, and the cortex, which is reason. We have built into AI tension. How does AI go about resolving that tension? Well, if the tension gets high enough, it gets aggressive. Watch out. How does it go about resolving aggression? I'm very concerned with building emotional sentience into AI. And then picking up on the cell phone. If I could leave us with one recommendation for parents, take the cell phone away. It's a stress generator. These are kids. They haven't yet learned how to resolve conflict. Work with, or if they have the cell phone, work with them. But the cell phone has become an instrument of stress generation for a younger generation, and they're not ready for it. They've seen that Japan. There's now legislation, but we face the dilemma of free expression, which is an adult right, not necessarily a children's right. And yet we face problems of schools saying to the teacher, take the cell phone out of the classroom. And the parents are arguing, no, I want to be able to stay in touch with my kids while they're in class.
No.
I know. Thank you, Victor. I can see all of your emotions. You wear them on your face. So do you, Dawn.
Our son did not get a cell phone until he was in grade 10, and only because he was taking public transit.
Well, maybe that's one of the interview questions when he gets to be an adult, when he goes to apply for a job. Did you have a cell phone when you were a child? Okay, Roger.
I appreciated some of the discussion and remarks, and I too I'm wary of AI. I have never asked AI any question. I have no intention of turning to AI. It's very data intensive, very energy intensive, and I'm a conservationist and a climate activist, and I don't want to generate more emissions just for kicks. So I have no intention of turning to AI, and I've watched too many Hollywood movies. I worry also about what could go wrong with AI. This discussion puts me in mind of something. I went to hear 50 farmers talk about water down near Cowley in I don't know, January, February. And at the end of the evening, I went around the community hall and I shook people's hand and I said, "My name's Roger. I'm from Calgary. I focus on climate." Not one of them batted an eye. They all shook my hand. One 70-year-old farmer, I said to him, "Most of what we hear in Calgary from rural Alberta seems to come from Take Back Alberta." And he said, "There is a false division between urban and rural Albertans. We have to talk to each other. We have to work things out together." and I took from that both encouragement and inspiration.
I think you've touched on a very important point, and that is the extent to which we are managing the consequences of urbanization.
Mhm.
It's a major change. It's happening worldwide. It's global in nature, and it's having impacts we don't even realize. I think homelessness is one of the spin-offs. So, Roger, thank you. And I invite all of you back for next week.